The Saskatchewan NDP is once again calling for rent control in this province. They're pointing to a Calgary-based rental company as the reason. Boardwalk recently purchased 3 new properties in Saskatoon and Regina, adding more than 200 suites to its portfolio. The company's latest financial report shows profits in Saskatchewan are up 13% compared to this time last year. The NDP says that's proof that landlords are drawn here by the lack of rent control and that tenants are paying the price. Boardwalk's CEO says the opposite is true. He argues that no rent control means more housing supply, more competition, and ultimately more affordable rent. In Alberta, they may not have rent control, but the province does have a rule that prevents landlords from raising rent more than once per year for the same tenant. Today on Blue Sky, we are talking about the push and pull over rent control in Saskatchewan. What is your experience renting in our province? Do you think rent control would help keep housing affordable, or would it discourage new rental units from being built? Maybe you're a landlord and you have some feelings about it. Call 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. We have 2 main guests joining us today. One of them is Sarah Beyer. She's the manager of policy with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. She's a policy professional with experience in nonprofit, public, and private sectors, focusing on housing affordability and Indigenous settler relations. Welcome to Blue Sky, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me.
We also have Peter Gilmer from the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry with us. The group has long been at the forefront battle over lack of affordable housing. Hi, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sarah, what does rent control actually mean?
So we like to refer to it actually as rent regulation, which can be a little bit more encompassing to cover off a few things. But really, it looks at how much rents can be increased over time, and so that can apply in a few different ways. So in some provinces, we have things like rent increase guidelines, where there's kind of a maximum limit that's set each year based off of things like the rates of inflation, for example. And so rents still can go up each year, but they go up moderately. And are, that guideline is meant to ensure that rents increase in line with other things like cost of living and income and inflation and all of those types of things. But then there are lots of other nuances to it. So that guideline could be applied just to a renter. So once that person moves, the rent on that unit could go up by however much, whatever limit the landlord might see fit. Or in other cases, that guideline would also be applied to the unit. So rents would continue to increase at that kind of more gradual, moderate rate, whether it's for one tenant over a long period of time or when a tenant switches over. So really, rent regulation is about ensuring that rents match things like cost of living and the rate of inflation, and really provide security for tenants, but also help to provide affordability, protecting really affordability across the rental system so that rents are not increasing at such a dramatic rate that tenants really just can't keep up with it.
You've been watching housing and the situation across the country. How does Saskatchewan compare when it comes to affordability and protection for renters?
Yeah, so currently, I think, as you mentioned at the top, Saskatchewan really does not have any rent regulation system in place other than, limits in terms of how often rents can be increased. And actually, Saskatchewan, as far as I understand, is a bit of an outlier in that in some cases, rents can be increased more than once a year, whereas for the most part across the country, rent increases are limited to just once per year. But we've seen recent data coming out showing that Saskatchewan rents are increasing very substantially, more than many other parts of the country. And we've seen even in Regina and Saskatoon, rents going up really, really quickly and dramatically and really faster than people can afford. And that lack of rent regulation really does stand out in terms of the context across the country. There are a few other jurisdictions like Alberta, for example, that don't have any, limits in terms of how much rent can be increased each year. But for the most part, across the country, we do see some type of rent regulation in place that helps to, put some limits on how quickly rents can go up.
Peter, where does the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry stand on rent control?
Well, we've actually had a position for 28 years on the books that we're in favor of rent control. And right now, I know a lot of folks will say the horse is already out of the barn, that rents have gone up so high, that how does this help the problem right now? But I often think, had we had rent controls in place over the course of the last 3 decades, what a huge difference that would have made, because we've had several times periods where we've had significant spikes in rent. And as was mentioned, we really are an outlier here. 80% of Canadians live in jurisdictions with rent control legislation, but we do not. And, the fact that we do have the highest increase in rents in the country is causing considerable hardship.
Both critics, including the province, we hear that rent control can discourage new rental construction, that if there is not necessarily that incentive for business owners to take on a rental property, that they wouldn't. What is your response, Peter, to that concern?
Well, I think that there's a couple of examples that would suggest that this really isn't the case. In Saskatchewan during the 1970s, when we did have rent control, there wasn't a decline in terms of housing starts. But if you look at the vacancy rate here in Regina right now, it's once again very low, and we, certainly supply and demand does play a role. However, a couple of years ago, the vacancy rate in Regina was over 7%, and during that time, we still had an increase in rents. And we had a growth in the number of folks who were unhoused. If we take Vancouver as an example, the growth in housing starts has actually been above, or new housing development has increased faster than the population as a whole. But the affordability factor has meant that people can't afford a place to live. So we believe that really it is absolutely essential to protect tenants and to protect people to have rent controls in place.
What about you, Sarah? What's your take on the economic side of it for the people who own those buildings?
Yeah, and I mean, absolutely. There are multiple studies as well as recent examples that show that rent regulation really does not deter the development of new rental housing. Really, there are so many other economic factors at play when it comes to, what is going to influence whether we're building new rental housing. So whether it's access to financing or availability of labor or land or construction costs, all of those different things are at play when it comes to whether or not we can build and maintain more rental housing. So just want to agree and reiterate that. And I think it's a pretty prevalent myth that we hear that rent regulation or rent control would be a reason not or would get in the way rather of building new rental housing, and we just don't see the proof of that at all. But when it comes to your question about how can building owners and operators maintain their costs, I think, the type of rent regulation that we want to see, again, as I mentioned, is not, a hard fixed cap that never changes and never goes up, but really that there should be a guideline that reflects, other costs that we see across the economy that allows for rents to go up gradually, moderately and predictably. And that creates, more certainty for both tenants, but also for landlords and developers as well, that there's some certainty in the environment there. And maybe just one thing to add too, that, when people have affordable homes and they feel safe and secure in those homes and they're not spending, 30, 40, 50% of their income on housing, it means they can spend that money elsewhere in the local economy. And, I think now more than ever, we really want to make sure that people are able to do that.
Okay. We want to hear from you. Do you have thoughts on rent control? Maybe you're for it. Maybe you're against it. Maybe you have an interesting experience renting in our province, or you're a landlord who has thoughts on this. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or send us an email, bluesky@cbc.ca. The Saskatchewan government has claimed that rent control hasn't worked in other places and that the province is an affordable place to live. CBC host Peter Mills spoke with a University of Saskatchewan economics professor, Sebastian Box-Couillard, and he asked him about that.
Well, the Saskatchewan government claims those rent controls have caused housing shortages wherever they've been tried. Is that true? Would it work here in Saskatchewan?
So it's the literature in the sort of economics literature shows that it does tend to lead to housing shortages in the long run. So there's definitely less of an incentive for builders to build when they rental properties, when they know that those properties will be rent controlled. The extent to which that happens is unclear. So you have sort of industry groups saying that they're going to, totally stop building anything. That doesn't seem to be, actually true. But in the same extent, it's also not true that it's going to have no effect on home building. So there's a little bit of truth in both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what about these these private companies as well that own a lot of rental properties in Saskatchewan? What impact can companies like Boardwalk have on rental prices?
Well, so these more sophisticated companies tend to have more aggressive pricing in that, and so there is compared to sort of, but they also have policies that they also tend to be sort of more above board in terms of sort of legal things. So compared to sort of the average a landlord that's sort of not part of a big consortium,
right?
So it can sort of go both ways in that. You can have more protection sort of legally when you're renting and sort of more services when you're renting from a big corporation, but rents do tend to be higher when that is the case.
Why might we see significant rental increases?
Well, so, if it's a profit maximizing business and if people are willing to pay, there's not really except for sort of moral considerations, there's not a reason for which, these companies would decide, if they can charge that much and there's demand for that, then they're going to charge more. So in Saskatchewan, there's been a big increase in population. There's a lot of population growth. There's very low unemployment. So there are cases of a lot of people not being able to pay, but in general, people are able to pay these higher prices, and that's why they're being charged.
Well, Sebastian, any other thoughts and maybe what you'd like to see the government do? Because, of course, it's this kind of push and pull. And like you said, there's pros and cons to every approach. Yeah,
I would just highlight that, if the goal is to, forestall rent increases for current tenants, I would say like rent control does do that. So if for current tenants, rent control can be a great thing. The question is just for sort of the future and future generations. If that leads to less supply, then that can be problematic. So the government sort of has to decide if there's a group that they want to prioritize. So that's one. But then in the long run, there are other ways of addressing this. So one thing you could do is put in sort of these means-tested vouchers. So you can give vouchers of, let's say $100 a month to someone who makes below X amount of money that they have to put towards their rent. So that makes rent a bit more affordable and it's a bit more targeted. And it doesn't lead to this sort of adverse supply effect. But of course, that's expensive, right? So you'd have to raise taxes somewhere else to do that. You can also, if you do bring in sort of a rent control thing, you can exempt newly built housing. So you could say, well, anything that's built after let's say 2025, will never have rent control. And then, so that doesn't reduce the incentive to build, for example. And then you can also increase renter protections in Saskatchewan, sort of just legal protections for renters, and that's also helpful.
That was Sebastian Box-Couillard. He's an economics assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan, speaking with our Peter Mills. What is your experience renting in our province? Do you think that rent control would help keep housing affordable, or would it discourage new rental units from being built? Maybe you're a landlord that has feelings about it. Give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. I did reach out to the government and asked them if we could have a minister join us. Instead, they resent a statement that they had released previously, responding to the NDP's push for rent control. In short, it says, quote, "This is yet another example of the lost and reckless NDP trying to promote failed rent control policies in Saskatchewan. Rent controls have caused housing shortages wherever they have been tried. Even the NDP backed away from rent control after it was part of their platform in their disastrous 2011 election campaign. Jurisdictions that have introduced rent control legislation frequently see fewer new housing units being built, ultimately resulting in less affordable housing being available. The NDP now appear to be calling for Canadian companies to be banned from investing in our province. This would further decrease supply and make it more difficult for families to find safe and affordable housing options. Saskatchewan remains the most affordable place to live, work, and raise a family in the country." End quote. So that's the word from the government on this. We did get an email from Darlene. The email says, government says we shouldn't complain because rent in Saskatchewan is still the lowest across the country. But doesn't Saskatchewan also have the lowest minimum wage across Canada? Minimum wage earners make up the biggest portion of renters, and rent increase affects them the most. Perhaps rent control on existing rental units, but no rent controls on anything built after 20 ? At least Calgary has the rule of not more than one increase in a year. That's from Darlene. And yes, I can confirm we have the lowest minimum wage. We share that dubious distinction, or whatever you want to call that, at $15 an hour. Sarah, I'll give you an opportunity just to respond to what the Economist had to say there. What are your thoughts on what he had to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and also reflecting on the comment from the listener there, I think there are different rules that we see in place across different provinces in the country that do include some, exemptions, for example, for new builds. In Ontario, for example, we do have an exemption for units first occupied after November 2018. There is no limit on how much rents can be increased. However, we did not see a huge, boon in rental housing construction once that exemption came in. And actually, Ontario has seen a pretty substantial decline in terms of housing starts. So again, we're really not seeing that correlation between either rent control getting in the way of new housing development or the removal of rent control helping to spur new rental housing development. And I think, it is really important what the listener was speaking to as well, that renters by large are earning far less than homeowners, and they're also spending a much higher proportion of their income on housing than homeowners are. So I think it really is so critical for governments to ensure that they are, using all tools available to them to help, ensure that everyone can have a safe and secure and affordable home. But also because, there are knock-on effects that happen when people lose their homes simply because they can't afford to stay there anymore. In Saskatoon, for example, we've seen huge increases in the rates of homelessness over the past few years. And we know that evictions and people just not being able to pay their rent are some of the leading causes of people losing their homes. So, and we know homelessness, in addition to being, a moral failure, is also very, very costly to governments, whether it's in the healthcare system or shelters or the justice system. There are all these knock-on effects that can happen and that can cost governments and taxpayers, quite a lot lot more than if we're doing some of that preventative work at the outset to ensure that people can just stay in their homes for the long term.
Today, we are talking about rent control on Blue Sky. Are you for it? Are you against it? We're talking about it again because the NDP has raised the issue again after Boardwalk invested in more properties here and saw an increase in their revenues compared to the same time last year. My guests are Sarah Byers from I want to get this right. She is from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and Peter Gilmer, who is with the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry. Peter, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to what The Economist had to say. What stood out to you?
Well, I was thinking a lot about the question of profit maximization with the growth of corporate landlords and the portion of the market that they're taking up. Because it really strikes me that corporate landlords are in a very good position to be able to represent their own interests and to make sure that their concerns are being met. But I really do believe that governments have a vital responsibility to make sure that tenants are protected and that they're protecting those folks that don't have those same resources. And, from the perspective that I'm coming from, we work with people who are living on a shelter allowance of $660 a month to pay for all their rent and utilities, $600 outside of Regina and Saskatoon. I'm thinking of all the seniors who are on fixed incomes and who, if there is a significant rent increase, as there has been, really don't have a lot of options and are really forced into kind of crisis situations. People on the assured income for disability who receive a little bit more than people on the Saskatchewan Income Support Program, but who are still looking at paying out a vast majority of their income on rents. It's very common for us to see people spending 80% of their income on rent, and we actually have a number of folks we work with who actually spend more on rent than they actually have income. So the numbers don't add up. It's caused a crisis in many ways, and we believe that governments have a vital responsibility to protect those people who have less resources to protect themselves.
So one of the things while I was doing research for this show, and one of the things that came to mind for me is New York City, because you hear a lot about rent-controlled apartments in New York City in pop culture, on TV shows, people not willing to give up their rent-controlled spaces. So I looked into New York because I found it interesting because they have two systems of rent regulation. They have it dates back. They had this housing shortage immediately following World War II. And so rent control generally applies to buildings that were constructed before 1947. And then they have rent stabilization, which covers buildings built after 1947, but before 1974. And rent control generally involves stricter limits, often freezing rent between tenancies or allowing for only very small increases. And rent stabilization allows for more moderate, regulated rent increases. And those are typically based on factors like inflation and operating costs. And there's a lot more information about rent control in the United States just simply because they've been doing it for so much longer. So I looked into this organization called the National Multifamily Housing Council, which is in the States. It's based in D.C. And it's where rental housers and suppliers kind of come together to look at housing needs and try to figure things out. And they had a whole piece on how economists generally are against rent control and typically list these 6 reasons. The first one is one we've talked about a lot, which is the inhibition of new construction. They feel like it's going to determine slower housing starts. They say it's a deterioration of existing housing because that landlords don't make as much money, they don't reinvest in their properties, and as a result, it reduces maintenance or repair on existing housing, and so it can deteriorate the existing housing stock. There is reduced property tax revenues for the cities involved because they have the market value controlled of rental property. So the tax implications can actually be significant. A study in New York calculated the loss in taxable assessed property values attributed to rent control at approximately $4 billion in the late 80s. And when you consider that for inflation, that would be a significant amount of money. They say substantive administrative costs because there has to be paperwork. There has to be someone who takes care of rent control. You would have to register your rental property, and that would have to happen in each city or in each province. In Santa Monica, California, the Rental Control Board in 1996 had a budget of more than $4 million a year to control the rent of just 28,000 apartments. They say it reduces consumer mobility, that people are less likely to move if they are in a rent-controlled property because they don't want to lose that property, or they will hand it off to a family member and the same family will stay in the same property for years and years and years. And there's not an opportunity for a landlord to necessarily change the rent on that property because of it. And the final one is consumer entry costs. That they are limited by significant entry costs that have to be paid by those in search of rental housing. So in many rent control communities, they say prospective customers have to pay a finder's fee to obtain a rental unit because there is such a scarcity of available housing. And it turns into this weird gray market, which goes back to handing it down through families and through generations. So I'm curious on those things. The one that stands out most to me is the substantive administrative cost. Sarah, in your opinion and in your research, who takes care of rent control? Who owns the cost of the administrative side of things?
So I guess it looks different in different parts of the country, but there often are either offices or tribunals that deal with landlord and tenant matters. I think importantly, those bodies are meant to, mostly help resolve disputes, right, between landlords and tenants. And I think those are actually really critical pieces of infrastructure to help ensure that we have access to justice, again, for both parties. So I think that, those are worthwhile investments for governments to make to ensure that, responsibilities and rights are being upheld and that everyone is accountable to the commitments and agreements that they've made in their tenancies. I think just to some of the comments I made previously as well, I think, while governments might be investing in these type of administrative bodies or other things to help manage these systems, when tenants are when their rents are reasonable and affordable, they are going to be spending money in other places in the local economy, and being those revenues are going to go back to governments in other ways. And to the other piece that I mentioned, if people are protected in their homes and have secure, affordable homes, it's much less likely that we're going to see these increases in homelessness. And we know homelessness is a huge cost burden, in particular on municipalities in Canada. And so, I think we really have to look at the big picture to find the right balance. And again, to make sure that people are, have that right to, a safe, secure, affordable home for the long term, especially as, homeownership is so out of reach for so many lower income people. We believe that tenants should have the same rights to, a safe, secure, long-term affordable home.
But is there any guarantee that rent would be affordable if they enacted rent control? Because if you can't put a cap on what a person charges for rent of a property, it could also make it more unaffordable and locked into law, could it not?
So I guess what I would say to that is, rent regulation is one piece of the puzzle, right? Like what it can really do is help to protect existing tenants, make sure that their rents are affordable, that they have security in their homes and stability. If the rent regulation system also included vacancy control, which means that rents are also regulated in between tenancies. So if a tenant moves, the landlord wouldn't be able to raise the rent, above whatever that limit that's set. That also helps to protect, affordability for future tenants as well, right? Because it makes sure that the rental universe as a whole is being moderated in terms of how much rents can go up. But again, rent regulation is just one piece of the puzzle. I think we know it's also so critically important for governments to be investing in affordable housing, especially, nonprofit, co-op, public housing that is actually going to be able to meet the needs of people who are, lower income or facing other types of, barriers, socioeconomic barriers. We also need to level out the playing field in terms of access to housing that's deeply affordable to people that are lower income. Rent regulation is not, it's not a panacea. It can't do everything. But I think it is such an important piece of the puzzle to make sure that, people have protection in their homes, and that we can help kind of stem the bleed of affordable housing, because we know that we're also losing affordable units faster than we can build them. And part of that is happening because rents are going up so quickly without rent control.
Peter, you mentioned that some people are spending 80% of their income on rent, just rent, nothing else. How are they, what are you hearing from people? How are they making life work if that's their rent?
Yeah, it's really impossible. A big problem here has been the shift to having people cover their utilities out of their shelter allowance on the CIS program. So not only do they have to pay rent, they have to pay all their utilities as well. So when I say rent is 80%, that's even before power, water, heat, etc. So, I guess, really it's made for people and households having to make impossible decisions, and that's certainly been a driving force behind the growth in houselessness. But when we look at it, we see that there's really three things that government can do to make a difference in a housing affordability crisis. And, one is to expand your social housing stock where rent is based on income, whether it's public, community, or nonprofit based. That's an important part of the puzzle, making sure that people have adequate income supports, adequate income security benefits, and living wages. That's certainly a key piece. But the rent controls piece is also, I think, central. And the key point here is really the capping of amounts that can be raised year to year. Because that really throws things out of whack when you have these huge increases. And the cost to administer that, I don't think is that great, to make sure that you've got some kind of reasonable accommodation in terms of what a rent can be increased year to year, that shouldn't be costly. There's also, of course, the issue of all the substandard and ill-maintained properties on the market. And I think that that is something that we need to be investing in, because the cost of allowing both houselessness but also unhealthy living conditions and people not being able to meet other needs has all kinds of financial costs to it as well. But really, while it's not the whole puzzle, I really do think that making sure that there's limits on how much rent can be increased in a given year is a significant thing that has to be done.
Who are you looking to? Who's doing it well? If you were to not to say anyone's doing it perfectly, right, because in this economy, everyone is struggling. But if you were to look to a city and say, I like what they're doing and that could work here, who are you looking to?
Well, I guess that the comparison I would make between provincial, national, and municipal jurisdictions with rent control is really whether or not they are actually fully capping the amount that rents can be increased in a given year. That seems to be the area where it makes the biggest difference. You can have regulation and rate reviews where an agency like the Office of Residential Tenancies could be playing the role of mediating rental increases. But at the end of the day, having some kind of predictable, stable amount that both tenants and landlords know that rent can be increased by in a given year would have such a positive influence in terms of family and community stability and really long-term cost saving for society as a whole.
But is there someone who's doing it well that you can cite as an example?
Well, I actually would like to study European countries that have rent control in place, but I think American cities have done a better job probably than any of the provinces, but at least we do have rent caps in several of the provinces right now.
Do you have thoughts on rent control? Are you for it? Are you against it? Have you experienced a significant jump in your rent in a month? We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-716-2221 or email us bluesky@cbc.ca. Darlene emails. She says, I'm a retired senior and have had to help a family member financially because of rent increases while there have been no improvements to the unit. It's either that or be homeless. Also, David emails, is there any indication when rent control is enacted, more landlords increase their rent each year, taking the maximum as the norm that they should all follow? Sarah, could you answer that?
It's a good question. I don't know if I could speak to that question specifically, but I think what I can say is that, the maximum limits that we usually see or that we would like to see are really in line with, like the rate of inflation, for example. Although we did see in some jurisdictions during the pandemic when inflation was really, really high, the provinces actually set the rent increase guideline below that, recognizing that was going to be, far out of reach for a lot of tenants. So yes, we do often see landlords raising rents to the limit that the guideline sets, but often that's, in Ontario, for example, that's 2.5%, and that can only happen once per year. So it does give tenants, some predictability in terms of, being able to prepare for that type of an increase to come. They have to have, a period of notice before the rent increase can come into effect. And again, compared to what we're seeing in other jurisdictions, like in Saskatchewan, where rents are going up 10, 20, 30% over year over year, having 2.5% is, much more manageable and reasonable, again, for both sides. And we know that having predictability in a market is a good thing for everybody.
Okay, let's go to the phones. Paul is on the line in Regina. Paul, go ahead.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for taking my call. I haven't heard the whole program, so I'm hoping I'm not repeating a point that's already been made. My observation would be that on the noon hour, you guys had a phone in, maybe 3 months ago, that was talking about the kinds of corporations that now own rental properties. Mm-hmm. A significant portion from that, your guests in that particular call-in pointed out that, a lot more sort of financial holding companies are in the rental, the accommodation rental business. And they have a tendency to, maximize profits, raise rents, generate a return to shareholders and all of those kinds of things, which may or may not necessarily be aligned with what's good for the economy and what's good for society. So, I think rent controls are one part of a broader conversation about, ownership structure, market forces versus, if government's building a significant portion of low-income housing, then, maybe we don't care as much that private capital's not incented because, they're doing it to make a killing. The headline from Boardwalk kind of points that out. And one of the reasons that Saskatchewan has one of the highest rates of corporate ownership, these kind of financial holding companies, is because we have almost no regulatory restrictions against it, whereas other provinces do. That's my comment.
Paul, I understand that you own rental properties in Regina, yes?
No, that is not correct.
Oh, no. Okay. Never mind.
No worries. Maybe I wish I did, but no, we're just we're fortunate to live in a detached home, and we're doing well.
Okay. Well, thank you for your insight. That's another perspective that I didn't think to add to this. So thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, Colleen in Saskatoon, go ahead.
Oh, good afternoon, Blue Sky, Saskatchewan, and my beloved city of Saskatoon, which is going, we've got super pressures because of the unhoused. And let's see, for one, I am under a corporate renter, like landlord. I won't mention the name, but every year there's a renewal of the lease, and every year there's an increase, and yet they don't know the population. Like, I'm a senior, my daughter's a student, so we're getting by on senior fixed income and student, lower end income from a province that just raised the minimum wage by 32 cents. You can't even buy a stamp with 32 cents, and also the lowest math outcomes. What are we gunning to be the Florida of Canada?
Colleen, thanks for that.
Okay.
Sarah, why do you think people are afraid of rent control? Why the pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a little bit about it throughout the program today. I think there's a really strong myth that has been perpetuated by those who stand to benefit from, unfettered rent increases that can help boost profits. We've also heard governments, of all stripes and at all levels kind of support those same positions, which again, we don't necessarily see the data that shows that rent control gets in the way of rental development or of actually rental upkeep. So I think there's been a really, really strong, persistent narrative that's been out there that really is not based in reality at all. And so I think, it's really encouraging to have programs like this helping to, combat some of those myths and get the information out there. And really, as we're hearing from callers, like, this has real impacts, real world impacts on people in terms of whether they're able to afford their homes, stay in their communities where they're close to, all of their services, their jobs, their education, their communities. And, I think it is, as others have said, it's so essential for our governments to really be prioritizing that, to make sure that we're creating, equal opportunities for tenants to have secure, affordable homes.
Okay. Want to go back to the phones. Ingrid in Regina, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to talk a long time ago when I was 23. I moved into a new apartment block in Regina, and they hadn't finished painting the walls. They hadn't put in the little toilet paper reset thing, and they hadn't finished the parking lot with the electrical outlets. And we had only been in there 2 months, and the owners tried to put the rent up. But I took a petition around to try and stop it because we didn't even have what we were already paying for, and they hadn't finished painting, etc. So, the problem with not having rent control is that greed takes over, and greed is in control. And we did have rent controls in Regina a long time ago. Seems to me it wasn't really stopping developers from building new apartments or homes or whatever. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you for your call, Ingrid. Peter, what are your thoughts on what our callers have had to say?
Well, I guess I'm thinking about one point that's been mentioned is with corporate landlords, when they raise the rent, that is money that's going out of the province. But as has been mentioned, when rents are controlled and they're not going up as much, that's more money in tenants' pockets to be spent here at home. So I do think that there's a really strong economic argument here for rent control. But at the end of the day, it really is about preventing the extreme hardship that we see from so many people who've had to deal with very large increases in rent. And as I said, if we'd had a stable market over these years without rent control, we wouldn't be in the crisis we are today. So this isn't just looking at where we're at today and providing some relief today. It's looking long term in terms of protecting tenants' interests in the long term. I guess one final point I'd want to make is that we also have to stop looking at housing strictly as a commodity to be bought and sold on the market. That really it is a basic human need. It's a basic human right that Canada and all the provinces, including Saskatchewan, have committed to under international law. And we need to be looking at some of those commitments that we've made and the protections that need to be put in place to ensure that they happen.
Sarah, we're up kind of against the end of the show here, but I'm wondering if there was a next steps. It's very clear our province is not going to go all in on rent control. The government has made that clear. But if there were some next steps that would help make housing more affordable, in your opinion, what would they be?
Oh, sure. I mean, I would certainly, encourage the government to look at what the NDP is developing right now and really consider what those broader socioeconomic benefits of rent control could look like. But I mean, as has been mentioned, we also need to make sure that we are building and protecting really deeply affordable housing that meets the needs of lower income people. And as was mentioned earlier as well, making sure that people have adequate income to be able to, afford market rent or be not having to spend 80% or more of their income on housing. We really need to, be looking at the rental system holistically.
Sarah, Peter, thanks so much for sharing your experience with and expertise with us today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much.
Sarah Beyer is the Manager of Policy at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and Peter Gilmer is with the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry.